Now in video lecture 3.8, we're going to put it all together. This here is a summary of our various high pressure and low pressure areas that predominate throughout the year. So along the equator we have that low pressure, getting closer to the 30 degree north, 30 degree south area. You have the high pressure, the drier conditions. Then we have another area of precipitation, another area of changing weather that we find there along the mid-latitudes, and eventually we get to the polar areas where we have that dominant high pressure that dominates year-round. That yellow line, that's the Tropopause. Once again, the Tropopause, it's thicker, or it's further away from the surface at the equator than it is at the poles, and that makes sense because we discussed that in video lecture 1. So this here is a very much a general pattern as far as what we would expect in March and September. But we know that this is a process in which we have movement occurring, and so now we have the December and January pattern in which all this shifts to the south of the equator, and that makes sense because the subsolar point moves as well. And so some things we're trying to visualize here is there's actually, now you look at 30 degrees north, where beforehand they were heavily affected by a subtropical zone, a subtropical high pressure. Now they're more in a mid-latitude area. And so when we understand climate changes, and so there's some places on 30 degrees north that actually have a very dry period of the year, and that's when the subtropical high pressure is over it. But then another part of the year where the mid-latitude area moves, and now it has a low pressure that dominates, and so now it's going to have a wetter winter in the case of 30 degrees north. And so this is going to be key to understanding climate when we look at video lecture 5 at that topic. Whereas now the pattern moves June, July, and we can see this shift. And so this shift we could visualize in a lot of different videos that we're going to look at in the discussion. So here's that ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Here it is in June and July. It moves north of the equator, and it's more pronounced over land, which once again, now we can relate the thermal equator to this idea. Whereas in the December and January period, of course, it moves to the south, and it's more exaggerated there over land masses, which once again goes along with what we've talked about there in video lecture 2. Alright, we've been looking a lot at some schematics, some models, arrows, visualizations. Next, let's now actually try to apply those and see if we can see patterns on this map here. This is the December and January pattern, so of course along the ITCZ we're going to have equatorial low pressure drop, and we're going to have high precipitation, and corresponding to that the world's rainforests. But then, of course, to the north and to the south, we're going to find the subtropical high pressure, the dry deserts, and we can kind of see that. If you look there in Australia, much of Australia, it's quite dry. You can see the Sahara Desert just north of the equatorial low pressure there in Africa. You can see parts of Mexico that's quite dry. You can see parts of the Andes Mountains that are quite dry. Continue on, we have the mid-latitude areas, and those are going to be where we're going to have migrating low-pressure zones. What do you mean migrating? That's the focus of video lecture 4. I'll talk about those migrating low-pressure zones a little bit more in depth. And then eventually we have our polar high-pressure zones. So this here is the December and January pattern. Now let's look at June and July. All of this then migrates to the north. So we see a changing pattern. And so now that subtropical high pressure zone, which was just there in Central America, has now moved and is now up there in the southern part of the United States and parts of Mexico. Whereas now the subtropical high pressure in the southern hemisphere has also moved up accordingly. And so that equatorial low pressure trough, now we look at the southern part of the Saharan Desert. Southern part of the Saharan Desert now has a good amount of precipitation there. And so this is an area of the world in which they have a dry period and then a extremely wet period. That's going to be a focal point of climate regions when we move on. Of course, the mid-latitudes, that all migrates as well. And here in the United States, we're minimally affected by the polar high pressure in June and July. We know this. Very rarely do we have temperatures that get down into the 40s or 50s in the summertime. Very, very rarely. But when we do, that's probably an indicator that the polar high pressure has dipped down and it's starting to affect us just for a moment. It's not going to last too long in the summertime.